Thank you. So my name is Peter. I'm a developer advocate at Google. For the last couple of years, I've been in London working with our developer relations team over there, and I moved back to Hamburg just last year. And I am one of the very few developer advocates working out of Hamburg. Very few meaning one. And today, I want to give you a quick overview of the Google Assistant, why we think it's exciting and why we think you should be excited about it too, and show you how you can extend it and build amazing experiences with it. So before we get started, quick show of hands, how many people here have used the Google Assistant before? Wow, that's the majority. So how many of you have Google Home in their home? How many of you have 2 homes in their home? How many of you have Google Assistant on their phone? Okay. How many iOS users are here? Okay, cool. Great. So that's amazing. So just why I asked this question, the Google Assistant is available on all our surfaces, and it's really important to keep this in mind. And we'll talk about this in a second. So at Google I/O this year, Sundar Pichai said, in the next 10 years, we'll shift to a world that is AI first. And the question is, what does it mean and how can we all participate in this? So there are a couple of things that we can observe. One of them is computing becomes universally available. And this has started with smartphones, but we have more devices on us all of the time, or most of the time. So we've got smartphones, we've got watches, we've got speakers, and most people carry around at least one of these devices pretty much all of the day. And your smartphone probably is not very far from you pretty much all of the time. I can honestly only think of very few situations where I'm not able to reach arm's length and be in touch with at least one of my devices. So I don't take my watch into the shower, so that's one occasion. So we're immersed in technology all of the time. Also, human-computer interaction becomes much more intuitive, or it has become much more intuitive, and we can thank a lot of companies and a lot of people out there for making that happen. If you remember the good old times when you had to communicate with your computer by using the command line, and graphical user interfaces meant lines and stuff to depict kind of windows using in text mode in 80 times 25 characters on a screen. We've come a long way since then, and it's really, really easy to use computers these days. If you have a look at children, they're able to use tablets just like that, and they're confused if you show them picture books because they try to swipe. Another thing that shows how AI makes our lives more enjoyable and helps us to build more delightful experiences are products like Google Photos. So who here uses Google Photos? Okay, so all the other people who didn't use Google Photos, find a person who raised their hand and ask them why it's so amazing. It's honestly, truly amazing. So just one example, I've got 3 kids, and I uploaded almost all my pictures of the past couple of years into Google Photos, and it's able to find all the pictures of all my children just by typing their name. So I type Leonard, for example, and it'll be able to find all pictures of Leonard, who's now 14 years old, way down to when he was a little baby. And all I had to do was tag him once. So I tagged one picture of him, a recent picture, and Google Photos is able to find him. You can ask questions like, show me photos of pictures who are hugging each other. So just type hugs, and it will show you pictures where people are hugging each other. Or you can ask for pictures of you and another person, and it'll find photos of pictures of you and the other person. So that's pretty amazing, and there is a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence in this product, and it's just one example of what's possible. And it's maybe one of the most prominent examples that we currently have. So mobile first changed the world in roughly about 10 years, right? So if we think back to when the iPhone came out, and then roughly 10 years later, it's pretty much normal sight to walk the street and everybody is holding a smartphone pretty much all of the time, and people really put themselves into danger by looking into their phones all of the time. And so we think that AI first will be able to change the world even faster because things somehow seem to accelerate. So let's talk a little bit about the Google Assistant. So a lot of people think that the Assistant is equal to Google Home because Google Home as a speaker is something that's rather visible and prominent. It's something that you can hold in your hand and you can look to, and it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's the Assistant. But really, the Assistant is much, much more. So the Google Assistant itself, that's kind of a conversation you are having as a user with Google and third-party integrations. And then we have Google Home and other surfaces, like your mobile device. And those surfaces are your entry point into the Google Assistant. And you'll use your mobile device, you'll use your speaker to communicate with Google. You can talk to it. And it'll talk back to you. So it's your entry point, your surface. And then we've got Actions on Google. And this is the platform that you as developers can use to build experiences on the Google Assistant platform. This is basically the SDK that you use to plug into the Google ecosystem and develop what we call third-party actions, or to keep it easy, just apps. I know it's difficult sometimes, so sometimes people say, oh yeah, I built a skill for Google. No, it's called an app or an action. It's not a skill. So here's an example for an app that we built for this year's I/O conference, and those of you who've been there might have seen it before. And it's kind of misleading because what you see here is a graphical representation that you'll be able to see on your phone, and it seems to indicate that you'll be able to see it on your speaker, which obviously is not true. But yeah, so you see your example conversation here. So it goes something like that. Okay, Google, let's talk to Google I/O17. And then you'll hear the Google Assistant say, sure, here's Google I/O17. And then, ding, that's what we call the earcon. It's called earcon, like icon. The product manager is a big fan of dad jokes, and he even has an action. It's called Best Dad Jokes. So that's maybe a reason why there are so many dad jokes in the Assistant. So and after you hear the earcon, you'll hear a different voice. So the voice that the Assistant uses is really mature and really, really good. It's the Google voice. And then we've got 4 voices for each language that we support. 2 male voices and 2 female voices. And they are pretty good as well, but there's a noticeable difference between those third-party voices and the first-party voice. So you'll hear a different voice saying something like, hey there, I have all kinds of information on Google I/O from the keynote to the sessions and so on and so forth. And then after this, the user can then say something like, when is the next Android talk? And it's very similar to what we experienced here. So you ask a question, you get an answer, and then potentially the conversation continues. And for us, it's all about the conversation that you're having. And we want you to think about conversations that you have with real people. And this is why we think the Google Assistant is such a powerful thing, because conversations that you have with a real person, they are really powerful, they can go really deep, and you can convey a lot of information. And if you think about how easy it is for you to tell another person what you want them to do, and how complicated it would be to write down what you want them to do, you can see why using voice is so powerful. All right, so at some point the conversation will probably end because you've satisfied your desire for information, or for some reason the application decided to drop out because, for example, you didn't say anything, and then there'll be another icon, the exit icon, and then you're back on the system level. Let me try to show this. So I built a small-ish sample, and let's see if this works. Cast my screen. Demo gods, come on. Oh. All right, anyway, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so I squeeze my phone. Talk to perfect listener.
All right, getting the test version of perfect listener. Hi, I'm the perfect listener. Go ahead and tell me about your day.
So in the morning I woke up and I had a nice breakfast.
Aha.
And then I got myself dressed and ready to go to the hackathon.
I see.
Got onto the tube. And then, yeah, we arrived in Schanzenviertel. I got off the tube.
I see.
Went to Beta House.
Aha.
Yeah, and eventually I arrived at this nice place.
I see.
What do you think?
Sorry, what was that? I didn't pay attention.
All right, so you might have noticed that this was a play on what another company did with, or what SNL did with another company's assistant. And I can show you the video later. So this is how the experience looked like. And you might have noticed that the voice that it used was different than the voice you heard in the beginning with the assistant itself. So there are a lot of apps on the platform already, and here are just a couple of examples. Many of them are already available in Germany as well. We launched the German platform in October, and since then it's possible for you guys to build applications on the German platform. And you can talk German to your assistant. So we encourage you to play around with those apps and get an understanding of what's possible. But how does it work? How is it possible that I can talk to an app, it talks back to me, it seems, well, it kind of seems to understand what I'm saying. How does it work? Why does this machine not work? Oh, come on. Wi-Fi? Should be good. There we go. All right. So on a high level, it looks something like that. The user says something, and then the assistant as a system, will listen to that. It will convert what the user said and turn this into an API request, which is being sent to your assistant app over there, which will do something and send something in text form back, a conversation response, which will be rendered into speech and be presented to the user. So it'll be presented by audio or on your phone screen. Well, there you go. This is funny. So again, with the example we had for Google I/O, here's how it looks. So the user says something. The assistant will do a lot of things there. So it'll do speech to text, which is a lot of work, as you can tell. It does natural language understanding to understand what the user wanted. So, you know, in this phrase, there is basically the invocation trigger. So the assistant then needs to call up your app, and it needs to send an intent there and tell your app, okay, so we want to start with this entry point because your app might have a couple of entry points. So your app then sends something back, like the welcome message. The user again says something. Again, we have speech to text. Something's being sent to your app. You might look into some kind of data source, like another API or a database. Do some processing, return text to speech, and then you'll hear the answer. To make this more handleable, we've got a tool which we call Dialog Flow. Some of you might remember it being called API.AI, but we thought that was rather difficult to pronounce, so we changed the name to Dialog Flow. And this helps with understanding what the user said. Because people say things in very complicated ways. So for example, if I was to search for a recipe, for example, I might say something like, I'm interested in a nice recipe for a tomato soup. That's one way to say what I want. Or I could say, do you have a recipe for tomato soup? Or I'm hungry, I want a soup. So there are so many ways to say this. And your app needs to understand that the user actually wanted to search for a soup or for a tomato soup. And you don't want to start writing regular expressions to try and parse this. You really don't want to do this. So Dialogflow helps by providing machine learning technology that makes it really, really easy to do this. And at this point, I think I'm down to navigating this like this. There you go. So again, the same picture, but this time around we have Dialogflow in the mix, so it will do all your text to intent conversion. So it'll understand, it'll take the input string, convert it into an intent, and then basically extract intents and extract entities and give those to your app, and then your app can handle this on a much easier way. So how does Dialogflow look like? So this is the Dialogflow UI. It's a web-based IDE, basically. And the main concepts are intents and entities. So let's look at them in turn. So on this screen, you see what we call an intent. And this is for an example where you might want to book a flight. So you'll see the intent name, then there is a couple of things going on here, and then there is a big section which is called the user says section. And in this example, you can see that a couple of example sentences might be, book first class ticket to Barcelona for tomorrow, or I need to book a flight from California to Seoul, or flight reservation from Seattle to Honolulu in the month of June. So really very different sentences. And a lot of concepts in there. So we've got places to go from or to, cities or states. Then we've got time indicators like tomorrow, so that's a relative indication. or in the month of June, which is an absolute time. And you need to understand what these are, right? So Dialog Flow helps you by understanding that these are different concepts and makes them available to you for you to actually pull them from the request and understand what the user said. So this intent matching happens basically every time there is a conversation turn. So the app triggers the user to say something. So for example, when you come into the application, it says, hello, for example, I'm a flight finder. From where do you want to go and where to? So this is the prompt. And then the user says something, and this utterance will be converted. So it will go through this flow, and Dialog Flow will parse the sentence and do this intent matching. And again, the next time when the user says something, it will again be passed through Dialog Flow and be matched. I'm sorry for this. Oh, there you go. So sometimes you've got an application that has a lot of use cases. So you want to understand that, for example, the user asked for flight bookings, that's one thing, or they might be asking for existing reservations, so that's a completely different thing. And what they might be saying in those two different use cases might be similar, but you need to make a distinction, and that's where contexts come in. You can say that after the user says something, you want to put your application in a specific state, and that's a context. So, for example, the flight search context or the booking lookup context. And this can be used to basically filter that all the other intents that are in your system will only be matched against this context. So you can say this intent here will only match if the user is in the context of flight search, and it won't be matched otherwise. You can also store data in the context to hold information about what the user asked in the past. What he asked in the past. This is really funny. So if you remember the flight search example, we had cities and other locations. And these are what we call entities. So city is an entity, a date is an entity, for example, the price might be an entity as well. You might specify the maximum price you're willing to pay. And Dialog Flow will match what the user says and try to fill in those entities. It's like variables, essentially. And not all your entities might appear in all the sentences that the user uses. This is something that we'll look into on the next slide, I think. But the system provides a couple of built-in entities, like time, date, time periods, numbers, age, currency, temperature, so on and so forth. Like a lot of things are already in the system, and it'll be able to understand those things. And then you can define developer entities. So for this example, it's for a recipe search app, and it has the concept of protein. So chicken, beef, tofu, anyone? And then you can, for each of those concepts, basically, you can define synonyms. So instead of beef, the user might say steak or brisket. But this means for you, for the search, well, it's basically beef. So even if they say brisket, you'll still search for beef. So you can define your own entities there. That's pretty useful. And then you can define prompts. So a prompt is useful when you need a lot of information and you want to make sure that the user actually provides this information. So in the example of the recipe search engine, you might need an information about is it a hot or a cold dish, or which kind of vegetable do you want to use, which kind of protein do you want to use, and these are required parameters. So you mark them as required, and if the user doesn't mention them in what they say, so for example, they just say, I'm hungry, I need a soup, and then the system detects, oh, they didn't tell me anything about the vegetable. The system will then automatically ask back and say, oh, you need to tell me about the vegetable you want to use in your soup. And this is what it's truncated here, but this is what you define in the prompt. So you can define prompts for all your required variables. The system will automatically ask the user to fill in those blanks. And then you need to hook up your backend somehow. You want to connect to your backend in order to react with proper responses. You want to look into a database, for example. You want to call up any other API. And this is where you basically hook up your webhook. And a webhook basically is just an HTTP endpoint that can be accessed via a URL. And you provide the URL down here. You can also provide authentication data for that if it's protected. And then we will call into your webhook. You can build your webhook using any technology you like. We recommend using JavaScript because we have got a JavaScript library that makes it really easy to handle requests and responses and generate feedback. But there are community-built libraries for Java, for Ruby, for example. And if you use a language that has no support whatsoever, you can directly parse and generate JSON, because in the end, we're just passing around JSON. And this is how it looks like. So this is an example conversation, and you can see that, for example, the user said, I want to have some chicken soup, and we detected that he said chicken. We don't have the dish type yet. Also, we don't have the cooking speed. So these are things that we need to ask now. Well, but you can see the general structure of this, and you can see how it's going to be rather easy to parse this. And this is how the client library looks like. So this is a very, very simple example. So you've got, this is the main structure. So your main request handler, you get a request and a response. And this basically just logs the request body and the headers. And then you have a response handler. And we're defining what we call an action map. So you have a couple of intents because your application does a couple of things, and those intents need to be mapped to your functions back here. So you'll have a function for example, to look up for a recipe or to look up something else. And then you'll have an action map which maps your intents to those functions. And you can define the action map down here, functions up here, and then we'll automatically map those together. All right. So, and we'll go into much deeper detail in the workshop later on. But I wanted to give you also some inspiration how you can actually make an application a great app and not just something that is like those infamous voice computers that everybody of us knows when they call up their bank. Please listen carefully because the options might have changed. Say one for I don't know what, say two for this. So, but instead, we want to encourage you to really create something that feels like you're talking to a human being. So think about a persona. If you are an enterprise and you're a company and you have an existing brand ambassador, then you should use them. You should use their persona to create your app. My go-to example is Nespresso. So if Nespresso were to write an action for actions on Google, who would be their brand ambassador? It's George Clooney. So they They would take him to the studio, have him record a couple of sentences, and then when you walk up to your Google Home and say, okay, Google, let me talk to Nespresso, and then you would hear George Clooney talk back to you and say, oh, welcome. What do you want to do? Do you want to order new capsules? I see your order is on back order, whatever. And then you'd have a conversation with him. And I think that would be really, really amazing because people know him and most people love him, I guess. And you know, you would bring his humor into this app. So that's one example. If you're not Nespresso, think about how your persona looks like. Are you funny? Are you quirky? Are you serious? And all these go into the design of your agent, of your app. The kind of sentences you use. Do you use longer sentences? Do you use shorter sentences? What kind of vocabulary do you use? Do you joke around or not? That's important. Also, really, really important, the human ear is trained for variety. So if I were to say the same thing over and over again, you'd be annoyed. If I would say the same thing over and over again, you'd be really annoyed. If I were to say the same thing over and over again, you'd be annoyed, right? So you really need to have variety in there. So when you're greeting a user, use different phrases to greet them. And the next time they come in, use a different phrase. Also, when you're in the conversation, use different phrases to talk with them. Sometimes you might have a situation where you didn't understand what the user said. So you need to ask back. And you should have variety in there as well. And you should, we recommend, and it's actually a policy, to ask 3 times and then essentially gracefully exit. So the first time you don't understand the user, you just say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. And then the next time, they again say something that you don't understand, like banana, or it doesn't make sense. You'll say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Did you want to, and then you make a suggestion, did you want to search for a flight, or did you want to retrieve your current bookings? So you're helping them. And then for the 3rd time around, if they don't answer or if they provide bogus, you'll say, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't get you there, but feel free to return anytime you know what you want. And then, ba-bum, you exit with the aircon. Very much the same if the user doesn't say anything. So that's the no input intent, which can only happen on speakers. So on phones, on top of supporting speech input, we also support input via the keyboard. So we don't have a timeout on the phone, right? So a timeout only occurs on speakers. So the no input intent only fires on speakers. And again, ask the user 3 times, hey, I didn't hear you, make a suggestion, and then 3rd time, exit. You can use what we call SSML, which stands for Structured Speech Markup Language. Oh, sorry, Speech Synthesis Markup Language. And there are a couple of things you can do. So for example, if you have an abbreviation, you can indicate that this needs to be pronounced as individual characters. So instead of saying SML, pronounce it as SSML. You can introduce breaks. You can even stream MP3 files. You can use this for audio effects, ka-ching, for example. Make it interesting, right? Or think back to the example of Nespresso. You can completely exchange the text-to-speech by using pre-recorded audio and make it a real good experience by using a voice actor or somebody from your company who has a nice voice. Then there's prosody, which is like how you say things. So you can slow down, you can tune the pitch, you can speed up and things like that. You can introduce emphasis or break things into multiple sentences. So there are a couple of things. SSML is pretty extensive. We support a pretty good subset of that. We don't support the entire set of SSML at the moment, but I'm pretty sure we will in the future. Reinforce with persistence. So this is, again, going back to greet the user differently when they return. So, you can detect if a user is returning. We support something which is called the user ID, and you can get it by calling this function, getLastSeen. You'll basically know, okay, so this is a returning visitor, and I should greet them differently, and maybe also ask them something about the last time they came in. So for example, let's say you are a movie recommendation app, and then the user returns, you could greet them, hey Peter, how's it going? How did you like the film I recommended last time you visited? So that's one thing you could do. But in any case, greet them differently. And also design for multiple surfaces. So keep in mind, this is not about speakers. It's also about speakers, but it's about phones. If you think about how many speakers you'd be potentially able to position in German households. So we've got roughly 90 million people living in Germany, I guess. And then how many households will this be? 40 million? I don't know, maybe less, maybe more. So that's a given number of speakers you can put out there. But people have more phones. Everybody has well, literally everybody has a phone, maybe more phones, 2 phones. So if you can get onto a phone, you'll be with the person all of the time. And you'll be with more people. So that's something to keep in mind. Design for the phone as well. And there are some really cool options. So on top of those speech bubbles, we've got a lot of UI options that you can use. So for example, this is called suggestion chips, and I apologize for the sickish green here. What you really see is 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons labeled 0, 42, 100, and never mind. And the user can basically tap on them and navigate your app quicker. So instead of having to say something, they can tap. And also, those suggestion tips help the user to understand your application. So you might use them to show the user functionality that they weren't able to discover otherwise. So that's pretty useful as well. You can display images or animated GIFs. You can use headlines or long-form text. This down here is a link. So if the user taps on a link, they'll be kicked out into the browser to read more, or you can link to an app. If your app supports deep linking, you can actually invoke stuff via the deep link. We've got carousels, we've got lists. And much more will be coming. And then finally, know the user. So one thing that's pretty exciting and which we launched recently are updates. So when you realize, oh, the user is returning quite often and they always ask for the same thing, you might suggest, hey, are you interested in receiving a daily update? And if the user opts in and says, oh yes, I'd like that, send me an update for 7 a.m. in the morning, you can schedule notifications. And then at 7 in the morning, the user will get a notification on their phone, and when they tap on the notification, they will be taken into the Assistant app, right into your app, right into the conversation, and then you can pick up again. So for example, you might want to send them a daily deal, or daily news brief, or whatever. So that's pretty cool. If you want to know more about the user, you can ask them. So for example, you can ask about their location. Obviously, you need to ask for permission. You can retrieve the coarse-grained location or fine-grained location. And then this is kind of the top-level integration. You can actually link to an existing account. So if you have an existing account system and users sign in to your backend, for example, via your app, by using username and password, then you can use this in an Assistant app as well, if you support OAuth 2. And the flow is something like this. So let's assume the user wants to log into your app in your Assistant app. The assistant will say, oh, it looks like your account hasn't been linked yet. Do you want to link your account? And then the user taps on a button, and then they'll be taken through this sign-in flow that you already know from various other locations. They'll be presented with an existing user account that's already on a phone, because on Android phones you are logged in usually, and you might have at least one or maybe two accounts, so you can choose one or create another one, and then the next thing that happens is they're signed in, and you have this connection between their Google account, which is used in the assistant, and your backend account from your app. And then you know exactly who they are. So if they filled in their telephone number, for example, or their address, you have those information. Or if they have an order history, you know what they ordered. Interesting side note. So for one of our launch partners, they told us that since October, when they launched, they were able to acquire a lot of, literally thousands of new users via this flow, because a lot of people tried out their app on the assistant and use another account. That is basically a trigger for creating a new account, which will be automatically created in your backend. So they were able to acquire a lot of new users just by having this new surface. Transactions will come to Germany next year. So you'll be able to have a shopping cart experience. People can put stuff in their cart, and then it'll be linked to the payment system on Android. You can use payment processors. Well, it'll be the German payment processors, obviously. And then show them their order update status and stuff like that. So that's pretty interesting stuff as well. Pretty exciting for a lot of people, I guess. And then the big question, how will people be able to discover your app? Because let's be honest, with the thousands of apps out there, it's really hard to know which are there. So the idea is to have over here, to have a directory and to be able to browse this list of apps here. So you basically go into the assistant, and then there's a button up here, tap, and you'll be presented with a directory. That's one way. You can also share a link to your assistant app via social media, on your website, email campaigns, stuff like that. All right, and then think about what makes a great app experience. So try to solve use cases that are quick, like stuff that happens frequently, ideally at least once a day, or maybe several times a day. Make sure it's personal, so it's something that is near to the user's heart, which really solves their need. And try to bring it on as many surfaces as possible. So, where do I start? So this is the Actions Developer Console. You can use it for free. Go to actions.google.com, basically, and then sign in with your Google account. But before you do that, think about what you want to do. Draft a persona, write a dialogue, and then go into the whole experience of creating the dialogue. Don't be tempted to use this. Don't be tempted to use those flowcharts, but instead use dialogues. Just think about how you would have a conversation, and then have those conversation fragments and draft them up and put them into Dialog Flow. We've got a ton of advice. There are PDFs, there are videos, there are posters that you can print out and hang to your wall about conversation design and understanding how conversations really work. Really recommend reading them. And then there are a ton of videos by a lot of my colleagues on how to build conversations, conversation design tips, so soft topics and also code level topics. A way to get started really quickly are templates. So there is a template for trivia games, there's a template for a personality quiz, and there are a couple of others. And these will be presented to you when you go to the Actions console. So actions.google.com, and there will be those templates. Try them out and play around with them. And also come to the workshop later today to learn about more, get hands-on experience. We'll have a couple of folks helping out, and you'll be able to build an assistant app literally in just a couple of minutes or hours, depending on how complicated you want to go. And then you'll be able to take something home and show off to your friends and your family. Finally, I did want to mention that this weekend there's also a hackathon called Talk to Me Hamburg, which is taking place at WeWork, and the participants of this hackathon will be here later today at 6:30, I guess. Matthias, 6:30? And they will present what they were able to achieve in literally just 2.5 days. And we'll have an award ceremony for them. So I encourage you to drop in and cheer them on, see what they were able to build. And with that, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your feedback.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. The microphone is coming to you, please wait.
Hello. So one question is about state. Basically, as far as I understood, this whole thing is more or less stateless. The current state is stored as a, memory of current dialog, but that's it. It's just sent as a payload on each exchange. Would it make sense to store the state at users so user can use the dialog from the multiple devices? Has people worked on that?
So there are a couple of things. So we recently launched a way for you to basically transfer a dialogue from a speaker to a phone. So if you start the dialogue on a speaker, and then at one point you decide you need another surface, for example, to show something, then your app can ask to be transferred to a device that has a screen, which is your phone. And then it'll be transferred to the user's phone, and they'll be able to continue the conversation on your phone as if they already had started the conversation on the phone.
Okay, another one, if you don't mind.
Sure.
If anyone wants to interrupt, please feel free. I actually have like 5 or 6, so please interrupt me. You mentioned about asking permissions, and when you ask with your voice, there is a certain freedom to misinterpret your voice into something, into yes, basically. So say application asks about your location or about your contact data, and you grumble something negative, but it says it's positive. Is there a limit to this application, to this?
So whenever you need to have a user interaction like that, and the sign-in flow was very similar. So for example, if you have a sign-in flow and it starts on the speaker, and it says, oh, your account is not linked yet, please go into the home app on your phone and sign in there. So you pull out your phone, and it has, you go into the home app, and then it shows a card which says, link your account to XYZ app, and you tap on that, and then the account linking flow will start. Very much the same for other permissions as well.
So it enforces user to actually confirm. Anyone else? Okay.
Are there some other questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of other folks.
Because we don't have too much time. I encourage you to go to Peter afterwards.
Yeah, feel free to join the workshop, and you'll be able to get all your questions answered. The other way around as well.
My question is about the conversation pattern. You said that instead of using trees, it's better to use a direct conversation. And how many different conversations you have to make. Because a tree is practical and based on every different path, you can always end up with an answer. But if you have all these different kind of answers, how many template of conversations you have to make to answer this question?
So let's think about searching for a flight, for example, right? So in order to find your flight, you need a from, you need a destination, you need a date, and potentially a price range, right? Or like the booking class. And you can basically handle this with just one intent. That's trying to get this information from the user. And by using prompts, you'll be able to get the missing information. And you know, once you found the user a flight, you want to confirm them. You want them to confirm if they want to use this flight or look for another one. So that's another intent. And you should try to keep it to the minimum. So don't have a long conversation when you can have a short conversation as well. And our advice is to basically prototype your conversation with on paper and pen. So one great way to do this is to have two people. One person plays the assistant and the other person plays the user. And then you write up a script for the assistant, and then you ask the user to try to resolve their use case. So they talk to the person who's playing the assistant, and then the person playing the assistant is only allowed to read from the script. Don't make up anything. And then you'll quickly notice if this is a good way to form the dialogue or where you need to make changes. And you'll get an idea of how people talk and what kind of sentences they use and what kind of vocabulary they use to get their requirements done.
But at the end, there'll still be a check that tries to check if all the information is there, and you're going to go back and ask another question, right?
Correct, and that's what you do using prompts. Okay. Maybe one final question? I saw somebody over there.
One final short question, please.
Yeah, so for me, most of the time, it feels like it would be easier to take my phone to ask questions, like type them in. Mm-hmm. Is there like the typical action you would do, use Home for or Assistant and not do it yourself?
So the use for Home is basically the hands-free use, right? So when you've got your hands dirty, for example, in the kitchen, and then you can just talk, that's the killer case for using